Addiction isn't a character flaw. It's what happens when a very old, very powerful brain circuit, one built to reward things that kept our ancestors alive, like food and connection, gets hijacked by something that triggers it far more intensely than anything natural ever could. That's true whether we're talking about a drug, a drink, or a phone notification. Researchers like Dr. Nora Volkow, longtime director of the U.S. National Institute on Drug Abuse, have spent decades building the case that addiction is fundamentally a brain disease, not a moral failing, visible in brain scans, not just behavior. 9 different doors, one shared circuit underneath all of them. Here's how each one actually works. Caffeine is the most widely used psychoactive substance on the planet, consumed daily by the majority of adults worldwide, most of whom never think of it as a drug at all. It works by blocking a brain chemical called adenosine, which normally builds up throughout the day to make you feel tired. With adenosine blocked, alertness increases. Caffeine withdrawal involving headaches and fatigue is an officially recognized condition, which surprises a lot of people. For nearly everyone, though, caffeine remains the mildest, most socially accepted item on this list. Genetics play a real role in how strongly any individual feels its effects, which is part of why one person can drink coffee at 9 p.m. and sleep fine, while another feels wired for hours. Nicotine tells a very different story. Tobacco use spread globally starting in the 1500s, but nicotine reaches the brain in a matter of seconds, triggering a rapid, short lived dopamine release that fades quickly, which is exactly why cigarettes get reached for again and again throughout the day. It's consistently ranked among the most addictive substances known, and despite growing awareness of the health risks, it remains the leading preventable cause of death in many countries. What makes nicotine especially difficult to quit isn't really the intensity of the high, it's how short lived each hit is, which keeps the brain reaching for another one every hour, rather than being satisfied for an entire day the way some other substances allow. Alcohol is one of the few addictive substances that's legal in most of the world, and it acts on the brain in two ways at once, boosting dopamine while also affecting GABA, the brain's main calming system. That dual action is part of why, unlike most substances on this list, severe alcohol withdrawal can actually be medically dangerous, sometimes even life threatening, which is why professional support matters if dependence has developed. Major health organizations now formally treat alcohol use disorder using the same disease based framework applied to other substance addictions, a shift that took decades of research to fully establish. Cannabis has been used by humans for thousands of years, and its legal status today varies enormously depending on where in the world you are. It works through the brain's own built in cannabinoid receptor system, receptors your body already has that cannabis happens to activate. Not everyone who uses it becomes dependent, but a meaningful minority do, particularly with earlier and heavier use, and its withdrawal syndrome. While milder than many others on this list, is a real documented experience that researchers only fully characterized in recent decades, well after cannabis had already been used by billions of people worldwide. Cocaine, derived from the coca plant and first isolated in the 1850s, produces one of the fastest, most intense effects of any stimulant by blocking dopamine from being reabsorbed in the brain, allowing it to build up to unusually high levels. That intensity is almost always followed by a sharp emotional crash, which can drive a cycle of repeated use just to feel normal again. Interestingly, cocaine was once sold openly in early medicines and tonics before its addictive potential was fully understood by the early 1900s. Overdose deaths involving cocaine have also been climbing again in recent years, partly linked to the same synthetic opioid contamination now affecting the broader illegal drug supply. Opioids may be the starkest example on this list of how a substance's story can shift entirely. Derived from the opium poppy and used for thousands of years, they were also widely developed and prescribed specifically for pain relief, and for some people, a single prescription can be enough to start the process of dependence. Opioids bind directly to the brain's own natural pain relief receptors, and their withdrawal is among the most physically severe of any substance covered here. Over the past 2 decades, overdose deaths from opioids rose sharply, driven significantly by the shift toward illicitly manufactured synthetic versions, which made accidental overdose far more common and unpredictable than with prescription forms alone. A medication that rapidly reverses opioid overdose in the moment now exists and is widely credited with saving many lives. It's a genuine example of harm reduction science working, even while the broader crisis remains far from solved. Gambling is where this list changes shape entirely, because gambling isn't a substance at all, it's a behavior, and yet it activates the exact same reward circuitry as every substance covered so far. Unpredictable rewards, it turns out, can trigger even stronger dopamine responses than predictable ones, and a near miss can feel almost as compelling as an actual win, which helps explain why losses so often drive bigger bets rather than a step back. In 2013, gambling disorder became the first behavioral addiction formally recognized, alongside substance addictions in psychiatric diagnosis, a genuinely significant moment for how addiction itself gets defined. Proof that you don't need a chemical substance at all to hijack the same underlying brain system. Gaming followed a similar path. Commercial video games have existed since the early 1970s, and many are deliberately built around reward loops, leveling up, unlocking achievements, collecting rare items that trigger the same dopamine pathways as gambling does. In 2019, the World Health Organization formally recognized gaming disorder, defined not simply by hours played, but by a real loss of control and genuine harm to daily life, schoolwork, or relationships. That distinction matters. Plenty of people play games for hours purely for enjoyment without it ever becoming a disorder, which is exactly why clinicians focus on impairment and distress rather than a simple time limit. And finally, social media, the newest and in some ways least understood entry on this list. Modern platforms are barely 2 decades old, but many were deliberately engineered using the same unpredictable reward principles that make gambling so effective, which is part of why an unopened notification can feel almost impossible to ignore. Unlike gambling and gaming, social media use isn't yet an officially recognized clinical disorder. The research is still actively catching up to how new this behavior really is, but early studies suggest some of the strongest effects show up in teenagers whose brains are still developing the exact self control circuitry that addiction tends to overwhelm. Some platforms have since introduced screen time tools and notification limits in response to this growing body of research, a small but telling sign that even the companies behind these systems recognize how deliberately engineered the pull really is.